If you visit a mosque in the United States, there's a pretty good chance that someone might hand you a pamphlet about Jesus and Islam that might be titled something like, We Muslims love Jesus. It might even say, We love Jesus more than Christians do. You find these kinds of slogans on billboards. I am Muslim and I love Jesus. And generally, there's a vibe out there that Jesus sort of joins Muslims and Christians together. In some of the less pleasant sort of variations of this, you see this idea that this kind of connects Christians and Muslims against Jews who reject Jesus. And you sometimes hear this idea that, Muslims accept Jesus as a prophet, so why won't Christians accept Muhammad as a prophet? I mean, there should be kind of like a deal. We do this, you should do the same thing. But all of this raises the big question, which is, who is the Jesus of Islam? In this talk, I'll be introducing Jesus in the Qur'an and speaking a little bit about the unique name that the Qur'an gives to Jesus, which is not the standard name in other languages or even in Christian Arabic, but a sort of mysterious name that scholars debate about. By the way, it's Isa, but we'll be speaking about where Isa comes from, maybe. I'm also going to be introducing a few recent-ish Quran translations into English and speaking about their unique takes on the material on Jesus in the Quran. And basically, I'll be sort of like affirming their general perspective, which is to emphasize the distinctiveness of Jesus in the Quran. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and introduce a bit further our general topic to the question approaches to Jesus in recent Quran translations. As you'll see, we will be doing this in just a few steps. I'll be speaking about the names Isa, and then the Christian Arabic name for Jesus, Yeshua. I'll be speaking about what's different or unique with the Quranic Jesus. Then we'll turn to these recent Muslim, all of them are Muslim Quran translations, that of Muhammad Asad, that of the team of Mohsin Khan, and that of actually 3 American women, all Muslims. In the translation is referred to as Sahih International. And then just some closing thoughts about, does the difference in name between Isa and Yeshua signal a greater difference in the nature of the Quranic Jesus and the nature of the Jesus of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the general thesis you can sort of see up here, recent Muslim translations of the Quran rightly emphasize its distinctive presentation of Jesus. Okay, let's go ahead and start with the question of Isa and Yeshua. I'll be speaking a little bit about this really intriguing journal article by Ahmed Jalad and Ali Manasir, but also just drawing your attention to the videos that we've done with Ahmed Jalad, several of them now that you can find on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. So be sure you check those out and get a sense generally of kind of the landscape of pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions. I'll be introducing the particular inscription that is the subject of this journal article on the divine name Ain Sin Ya. So we'll be speaking about that a little bit here. And I mean, let me just kind of take a step back and remind you of the problem of the name Isa. And basically the problem is no other languages, including also Christian Arabic, none of these languages or dialects use anything like the name Isa when referring to Jesus. All of them use some form derived from the Hebrew Yeshua, the key thing is the ayn, that consonant, which if you're not an Arabic speaker, you might be thinking like, what is that backwards apostrophe thing? That's an ayn, it's a consonant, not a vowel. It's at the end of the word. But in Isa, it's at the beginning of the word. And, friends, like some people have theories that, maybe somehow it disappeared from the end and popped up at the beginning. But, this doesn't happen. Like these are not the same words or names. They're not versions of each other. These are different names. I mean, I'm kind of going against the grain of the most common way of explaining where Isa comes from, which is sometimes through Syriac, maybe Eastern Syriac, or different dialects of Aramaic, some idea that, well, in this dialect or in the East, the ayin is not really pronounced as an ayin, so it could kind of disappear. Then you have to explain why it appears at the beginning of the word. Some people say, well, maybe it happened through Greek because the ayin in the Greek version of the Hebrew term Yeshua, the Jesus, the ayin is gone, so maybe that's how the ayin disappeared. But then you still have to explain why the ayin showed up. I mean, I've heard some different explanations, both for the disappearance of the ayin and for its reappearance, so-called reappearance at the beginning of the word. But I mean, you just get the sense when you read these studies or theories that they're really working hard at it. And probably the simple explanation is that Isa, even though it sort of sounds like Yeshua, the Christian name for Jesus in Arabic, chances are, Isa is just a completely different name. Okay, so the ayin is different. And, and I know Yeshua has a sin, Isa has a sin, so you might think that they're kind of the same because they kind of sound similar, especially to non-Arabic speakers who may not be attentive to the ayin, but probably these are just totally different words, okay? But if that's the case, why is the Qur'an using a totally different word for Jesus? I mean, that's a pretty good question. And we have a possible answer to that question in the study of Ahmed Jalad and Ali Manasir that appeared in the Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association in 2021. And the article is based on the discovery and study of an inscription in the northeastern desert. Excuse me, hopefully this cough will go away. I won't be coughing throughout this video. In the northeastern desert in the country of Jordan. So, I mean, just kind of remember that Arabic speakers before Islam, not only after Islam, were spread far beyond the boundaries of modern-day Saudi Arabia. There were many Arabic speakers all throughout Jordan, even up into Syria, even into Western Iraq. There were Arabic speakers, and we have, thousands of pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions that are all over these deserts in Syria and Jordan, etc. And this is one of these inscriptions, which we'll be introducing a little bit further on the next slide, which was found in Jordan. And I mean, as we'll see in a moment in greater detail, it includes this key root, Ain Sin Ya, which is the root, in fact, for Isa. Not only that, it seems pretty clear that this word or this root, Ain Sin Ya, in the inscription refers to a deity. So there's an invocation to a deity. Okay, so just, I mean, maybe you've already read it as I've been talking on the slide, but over here is kind of the introduction to the problem of Isa and Yeshua. The reference to all these other languages have some form of Yeshua from Hebrew. Maybe you can go through Greek or maybe even Ethiopic to try to get rid of the ayin and add a new ayin. But it seems more likely that it's coming from a completely different origin. Okay, first of all, I just said northeastern section of Jordan. Come on, technology. So, I mean, you can see this is Syria here. This is the border. This is kind of, the arm that sticks out in northeastern Jordan when the colonial powers just split up different countries in the Middle East after the First World War. They gave this area to Jordan. So that's where the inscription is found. There's a kind of a path which connects or leads people to a watering hole there where there's a whole number of inscriptions. And among them is this inscription here, which has 3 parts. But the key part for us is this invocation. So the Hey represents O, and then the reference to the deity, Ain Sin Ya. So O, Ain Sin Ya, and we'll see in a second how that might be pronounced. And then there's some really key things here because this is sort of the imperative verb asking for help. And people will recognize this root, Nun Sad Ra, from the Qur'an because the Qur'an refers to, for example, those around Jesus as not only Hawariyun, but also as Ansar, helpers. from this root. Of course, this enters into Islamic tradition as the name for the helpers of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. So, and then there's another root that people recognize from the Quran or from like everyday speech, this kafara, which is in the Quran used for unbelief. There's some other meanings as well, which we won't get into right now, but principally for unbelief. So people may know the name kafir for infidel or unbeliever. And this invocation, the third part of the inscription, is rendered by Ahmad al-Jalad, O Ain Sinya, this deity, help him. So there's the pronoun there, the hey, against those. So the help again is nun sadra, who deny you. And deny is from the kaf fa ra, and then the ka is a pronominal suffix, second person singular, and so a reference to Ain Sinya. So, I mean, Professor Jalad has explained in the article, he's onto something, that this language is very kind of, monotheistic. These roots, they become very prominent in the Quran. And there's a concern with people who deny a certain God, which doesn't really feel pagan or polytheistic. I mean, I don't know this stuff too well, but I mean, generally what you hear is that pagans were just kind of like flexible. You can believe in this God or reject this God. It's totally fine. Basically, it's up to you. It's like kind of Gen Z vibe with religion today, like believe in this God, don't believe in this God. You want to choose another God, that's fine. Like everyone can have their own God, right? But monotheists tend to be much more strict about these things. There's one true God. Those who believe in him are sort of on our team, are the friends of God. Those who deny him are the enemies of God. And so there's a reference here to help against those who deny presumably the true God. And so it could be monotheistic, and it could be that the one God who is being invoked is this God, Ain Sinya. Okay, so just a few more details here. Now, okay, there's a problem here, which is this is not a Paleo-Arabic inscription. So Paleo-Arabic, I mean, you'll find more about this in our interviews with Ahmad al-Jalad. Paleo-Arabic is that early form of the classical Arabic script. This inscription is a Safavidic inscription, which means that it's written in one of these ancient North Arabian scripts, even though the language is basically Arabic. But it also, kind of dates the inscription because when we get to the 5th century, suddenly all the Arabic inscriptions are in Paleo or Old Arabic. By the way, they're also monotheistic. So this is probably a 4th century inscription. Now, why is this a problem? I said it's a problem. Why is this a problem? The problem is that, as a rule, the Safavidic inscriptions, so the inscriptions that are earlier than Paleo-Arabic, are polytheistic or pagan, right? So if this is a monotheistic, potentially Christian inscription, it's pretty unusual in the Safavidic corpus. I mean, Ahmad al-Jalad will know how unusual, but it's definitely unusual. We have this kind of what we've spoken about before in other videos as a revolution before the revolution of Islam, which is the revolution which sees all the ancient North Arabian scripts disappear, replaced with Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, and we see all the polytheism of the ancient North Arabian scripts also disappear, and instead we find monotheism and principally Christianity. Okay, so I just want to note that I've kind of said these things. There's a pretty dashing photo of Ahmad al-Jalad. I mean, I should ask him if we can get him back on where he got that hat, but he's looking very good. Okay, so here's the rock on which the inscription was found. This is just coming from the article, the great article in Jigsaw, co-authored by Ahmad al-Jalad, and he says, basically, if we see this term Ain Sinya as a reference or an invocation, reference to or invocation of Jesus, what this means is that some Christians among the pre-Islamic Arabs were referring to Jesus with the root Ain Sinya, and others following from the Hebrew and the Aramaic, Syriac, we're referring to him as Yasin Ain, Yeshua. So like both were out there, right? So that's kind of the theory. That's the proposal that some Christians were calling, probably most were calling Jesus Yeshua, and others, probably a minority, were calling him Isa, or as we'll see, maybe Isa. There's some reason to think that that long vowel at the end of these words, including, by the way, with the name Yahya in the Qur'an, Yahya for John was pronounced A and not so it would have been pronounced Yahya for John and Isa for Jesus. Okay, so anyway, hopefully that's clear. Both names were kind of out there. Yeshua, probably the majority of Christians, Arabic speakers, spoke of Jesus as Yeshua, but a minority of them would have spoken of Jesus as Isa or Isa. And he says, I mean, we already have a possible example that could testify to this sort of linguistic behavior, because the Quran departs from the Semitic name for John, which is, Yohanan, Hebrew Yohanan, in some way. Again, in Christian Arabic, the Christian Arabic speakers are following the Hebrew and the Syriac, and they call John Yohanna. And the Quran comes up with Yahya, which is like, where is Yahya coming from? All sorts of arguments, kind of parallel case. Maybe we should do another video on Yahya, but a parallel case. Ahmed Jalad argues that Yahya or Yahya was being used in Safa'idic, and so most likely the Quran is drawing from Safa'idic, okay, from pre-Islamic ancient North Arabian. Okay, so the name Ain Sinya is used as a person's name in other cases in Safa'idic, so it is attested, but as far as I know, someone could correct me, maybe Professor Jalad will jump in on the comments. As far as I know, it's not used elsewhere as a divine name. But just to go back to the previous slide, in this inscription, it's pretty clearly a deity, because there's this invocation, "Oh, Ain Sinya, help him against those who deny you." It was pretty clearly a theonym, or a name for a god. And why would this name be used for Jesus? So, I mean, why would anyone think that Jesus is at stake here at all? It's because the Quran calls Jesus Isa, right? And so you kind of work back and you say, oh, this old inscription that has an invocation to a deity named Ain Sinya, that must be Jesus, because we know from the Quran that Isa is Jesus, right? So what could it possibly mean? I mean, I can't really go toe-to-toe with Professor Jalad on this, but according to the article, well, this root could mean something like purchasing, and then the active participle would be ase or asi, meaning purchaser, and that could be the original form of the name that becomes Isa in the Quran, asi or ase, which would mean active participle, right? Like the one who's purchasing thing. In theologically, this would make sense, because Christian devotion to Jesus, I mean, is sort of saturated with the concept of Jesus is the one who has purchased or redeemed our souls. And indeed, Christian Arabs refer to Jesus as El Fadi, and Christian Arabs take the name themselves, Fadi, very commonly. And so that would be a parallel route to ransom, and it would be parallel to the Greek title for redeemer, Soter, or in Assyriac, Paroqa, a redeemer. So does that make sense? Oh, so what this would mean is that the Quran is using a name for Jesus, Isa, that is incredibly rich with Christian theological meaning, with the concept of redemption and ransoming. The Quran, of course, would not sort of agree with this take on Jesus as Redeemer. The concept of Jesus as Redeemer is not clear in the Quran at all. In fact, according to the majority view, at least, Jesus doesn't even die in the Quran. His death is denied, according to the common take, in Quran 4, verse 157. So, I mean, let alone, I mean, he clearly then could not have been a redeemer whose death sort of pays the price for the sins of humanity. So, there you have it. The final bullet points just sums up what I was speaking about there. Okay, so I'm going to sort of turn now to the second part. There's a couple of slides on this. This is the first one to speak about just, what's distinctive about the Qur'anic Jesus. So that first section kind of set things up, right? Because it's just sort of emphasizing the point that the Qur'an uses either a completely new or an uncommon name for Jesus. And so then we might ask the question, is Jesus of the Quran a fundamentally different character? I mean, there's a lot that's different with the Quranic Jesus. A lot, a lot, a lot. And I mean, sometimes with my students, I make the point that, like, just because two people have the same name, and actually in this case, they don't have the same name, but even if they did, I mean, in English, we say Jesus and Jesus. I know some Muslims like to say Isa, even in English. But I mean, let's just say everyone's saying Jesus. I mean, even if you have the same name, doesn't mean you're the same, right? Like, I don't know, there's Michael Jordan and lots of other folks named Michael. Michael Jackson. One is a singer, one is a basketball player. I mean, they're pretty different. So in the same way, we can ask a question, if we kind of look at the bio of the Jesus of the Quran and the Jesus of the Gospels, how much do they actually have in common? Potentially, does the Quran use either a new or a minority name with Jesus just to make that point that its take on Jesus is so different? By the way, this movie poster over here is from an Iranian movie that I show my students sometimes by a director known as Nader Talebzadeh. I don't know, it was done like early 2000s. Someone maybe in the comments will get the year and maybe knows a little bit about it. But one of the cool things about the movie that kind of corresponds with my talk is that there are two endings. So it's one of those movies, there's been a couple of those through the years, one of those movies with two endings. In one ending, there's got a little screen with words which says, the end of Jesus' life according to the Christian Gospels, and you see Jesus crucified. And then it turns to another ending, again, a blank screen with some words that come up, and they say, the ending of Jesus' life according to the Gospel of Barnabas and reliable Islamic sources. And there you see Jesus doesn't die, but Judas takes the shape of Jesus, and Judas dies, and Jesus goes right up to heaven. So interesting movie. Anyway, it's not the time to speak too much about the movie. Okay, so I'll do these slides pretty quickly. This just to remind you, there are common bits in the Christian Gospels and the Quran about Jesus, his virgin birth. He heals people. He raises the dead. But in the Quran, it's by the permission of God. He's associated with the Holy Spirit, both in the Gospels and the Quran. He's opposed by the Israelites. He lightens the law of Moses. So, you see this in Quran 3, where he says, I will make some of that which was forbidden to you permitted. He ascends to heaven, whether or not he dies. Quran 4:159, has that line, Rafa'ahu ilayhi, God raised Jesus up to himself. And, definitely in the Gospels and in the book of Revelation, Jesus returns in the end times. In the Bible and in the Quran, there might be a hint, where Jesus maybe is called a sign for the hour being, like the hour of resurrection, divine judgment. So there might be a hint that Jesus returns in the end times. Actually, in later Islamic tradition, it's basically a consensus that Jesus will return in the end times in their various hadith, which describe what he will do when he returns. Okay, so that's what's common. That's pretty significant. There's some things that are in the Quran that are not in the Gospels. The things that he says in the Quran are not the things he says in the Bible. Right, so that none of his statements in the Quran, there's not a lot. Most of his statements are sort of polemics against the Jews of his time or against his own followers. And they just, for example, Quran chapter 5, verses 72, 73, or 116 to 118. They're not in the Gospels, right? They're just different. There are various miracles, which I won't go into depth now, which are not in the Gospels, but are in the Quran. Most of these are connected with later so-called apocryphal gospels. The emphasis of Jesus as a magician, which does appear in Jewish anti-Christian writings. This is mentioned in the Qur'an. And then, of course, very important is a prediction of a messenger who will come after him in the Qur'an, who will be named Ahmad, which is obviously not in the Gospels. And then really interesting point that I'll return to is that Jesus seems to be associated with militancy in these two verses, Quran 61 and Surah At-Tawbah, Quran 9. And his helpers seem to be part in Quran 61:14 of this sort of militancy. It's kind of ambiguous, but that is in the Quran, not in the Gospels, okay? And then finally, and maybe his escape from the crucifixion, which I don't know, maybe that's stuff for another video. Okay, so but how about what's in the Gospels but not in the Quran about Jesus? I mean, almost everything. Gospels are pretty long texts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, they're all about Jesus. There's tons of stuff about Jesus. Very little of that is actually in the Quran. So just as none of the few statements in the Quran that Jesus speaks are found in the Gospels, none of the statements, which are extensive, not few, extensive, lessons about God, parables, discourses about his own identity, his divine mission, his relationship with both his opponents and with his friends, his disciples, lessons about God. None of that, Beatitudes, etc., none of that is in the Quran. So by the way, some of that will enter into later Islamic tradition in various sayings in works like Ihya al-Ulumuddin of Ghazali and works like that. So I'm going to get back to this image. I want to speak about that in a second. But I mean, I'll just open up all the bullet points here. No, go back. So, I mean, parables, all of the parables, all of them, prodigal son, lost sheep, parable of the sower, they're not in the Quran. The Beatitudes, loving your enemies, turning your cheek, removing the log from your eye instead of the speck of dust from your neighbor's eye, defilement coming from the bad things on the inside of one and not from the food that one eats, not in the Quran. The infancy narratives, the visitation of Mary and Elizabeth and Mary's proclamation of the Magnificat when she's pregnant with Jesus, bringing the baby Jesus into the temple where Simeon and Anna, various proclamations, or the young boy Jesus speaking about his father's house in the temple. All the narratives in Galilee, all of them, synagogue, nature miracles, everything that happens in Jordan River, including the baptism by John the Baptist, the meeting with the woman at the well in Samaria, everything that happens in Jerusalem, the transfiguration, where God affirms that this is my beloved son, all sorts of miracle accounts, the miracle at Cana, walking on water, the multiplication of loaves and fish. All of these things are not in the Quran. I said I mentioned this briefly. So this is a part of a work of art by an American artist who did this after 9/11 and wanted to show Muslims ways of connecting their faith to America and Americans to begin to think of Islam as, an American religion, not a foreign religion. He wrote out by hand a translation of the Quran and then illustrated it or illumined it with scenes of American life. So this is Quran 19, Surat Maryam or Mary. And so you see this market here with Our Lady of Guadalupe. So pretty cool. Okay, just more that you do not find in the Quran, that you do find in the Gospels. I don't want to go on ad nauseum, but all of the characters around Jesus, the Quran just refers sort of ambiguously or vaguely to Hawariyun, and the Gospels go into great detail. I mean, watch the series The Chosen, and you'll get to know some of them. Peter, all the disciples, Lazarus, Mary, Martha, Mary Magdalene, Zacchaeus, Herod, Pilate, Caiaphas, all these characters are missing. Interestingly, like in the Gospels, one of the main themes is Jesus's discourse in tension with the Jews around the Sabbath, Jewish law generally, but especially the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. Jesus speaks of himself as Lord of the Sabbath. All of this kind of question of the Jewishness of his day is sort of missing. This is why you sometimes hear this idea that, the Quran has a more Jewish Jesus. I mean, the Judaism of the Gospels, like that whole fabric, which is interwoven almost in every passage of the Gospels, is missing in the Quran. It's just not there. Questions about, Jesus and Jewish law, except for Quran 3, that one statement that he's lightening the law, all the questions of the Sabbath and kosher rules, and the temple, the practices, the various Jewish feasts rather, and fasts, they're just missing from the Quran. Okay, also missing Holy Week, obviously in the Passion narratives, triumphal entry, so-called Palm Sunday, cleansing the table, Last Supper or institution of the Eucharist, agony in the garden, etc., etc., etc. And needless to say, all the things that happen around the crucifixion and then the resurrection and the ascension on the Mount of Olives, the road to Emmaus scene in the Gospel of Luke, at the end of the Gospel of John, where Thomas, touches the wounds of Christ, says, "My Lord and my God," obviously for theological reasons, is not in the Quran. Okay, now on to basically the third part of the talk, third and more or less the final part of the talk, where we'll be speaking about the some of these recent translations of the Quran. Just here's a screen so you can see the translations and the translators. So first one is Muhammad Asad, looking really cool in this photo from Radio Pakistan, I believe. I'll speak a little bit about his life in the next slide. And then I'll mention, here we have the translation of both Hilali and Khan. That's a picture of Hilali on the bottom, who is a Moroccan Salafi. So I'll speak a little bit more about him again on the next slide. And then finally, Sahih International, which, as I mentioned very early in this talk, was done by 3 American women. The most sort of the lead of them, as far as I know, although someone might correct me in the comments, is an American woman named Emily Asami, known as Muhammad, the mother Muhammad, presumably because her oldest son is named Muhammad. In this translation is referred to as Sahih International. So all Muslim translations. I mean, recent I put between quotes because, as we'll see, a message of Quran is not that recent. The translation is in 1980 and Noble Quran, so 1985. So, I mean, it's not too recent, but it's recent-ish. Okay, so just to introduce these characters a little bit, let me take this one by one. Let me back up a little bit. I mean, I'd really like to do another video actually on Muhammad Asad's life. But, very, very briefly, as some of you may know, he was born a European Jew, actually born in what is today Ukraine, although, he went eventually to Austria. He's usually referred to as an Austrian. I mean, this is complicated because we're talking about back in the days of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they're kind of in control, the Habsburgs are in control of all of this. He went off to Palestine to do some newspaper work. He actually converted to Islam, not in Palestine, but when he was back in Europe, when he was in Germany. He married an underage Saudi girl named Munira. The famous anthropologist Talal Asad is the son of Munira and Muhammad Asad. By the way, Asad, of course, is lion in Arabic, and Leo, he's Leopold Weiss, or Weiss, was his birth name. Leo also means lion, so that's what's up there. Became a Pakistani citizen, actually worked as an envoy to the UN. His translation was sort of controversial, not sort of, was controversial. It was actually banned. I mean, most people in Saudi Arabia are using Arabic anyway, but it's banned in Saudi Arabia for English speakers there because of its rationalism, basically. So he denies things like supernatural miracles. He's very sort of tentative about seeing even things like the jinn and demons as supernatural creatures. Again, I'll speak more about him hopefully in another video. And then the translation of Hilali Khan. Hilali is a very interesting figure. His life sort of spans the reformists of sort of like Muhammad Asad Rashid Rida in Egypt. He was a Moroccan. And then later on, he went through the period of the Second World War. And then later on, Saudis like Bin Baz. So really, really interesting character. Got involved, was kind of shaped by Rashid Rida, who in a way was Salafi. Rashid Rida is another video, a complicated figure, Syrian, Lebanese, settled in Egypt, was kind of both Salafi and reformist at the same time. Hilali unfortunately became really sort of enamored with Hitler and the Nazis because he saw them as sort of advocates for Muslims generally against colonial rule, or at least he bought into that propaganda. Also an advocate for Palestinians. And he actually went to Berlin in the middle of World War II and ran an Arabic radio show in Berlin to sort of, communicate the message of the Nazis, uh, presumably, the anti-colonial element of it to Arabic speakers. Anyway, he, survived World War II and ended up in Saudi Arabia, where he's a student of the famous Mufti bin Baz. He's had a lot of criticism for his translation, which is, very much based on the hadith, sort of reading the Quran through the hadith and the tafsir. One, I think, American Muslim, William Peachy, who I think also settled Saudi Arabia, wrote this. No one likes it except the Saudis who don't know English. So there's that. Khan, I don't know much about except he was Afghani. I also has a translation, Sahih Bukhari. A lot could be said. I mean, maybe the translation or a video on the translation of Muhammad would be interesting. She's American, raised in some sort of Christian, presumably. I don't actually know. She's still alive. Maybe Muhammad will join the comments as well here. She has an interesting story that you can find in some interviews where she went to Syria with her Muslim husband and asked to convert to Islam. And in those days, I believe it was the 60s when, this kind of Arab nationalism was going on, maybe 70s. And, it was kind of like Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs should just unite as, and actually, as you may know, Syria and Egypt at one point formed the United Arab Republic. They formally joined, I think, under Nasser. Someone might correct me. I'm not good at modern history. Anyway, she actually had to go through sessions with a priest who would try to talk her out of converting to Islam, but she did convert and eventually settled in Medina. And she says that her translation is largely based on the Hilali Khan translation, but we'll see there are some differences. Okay, that's an introduction. Now, finally, we're going to get to Jesus. I mean, we're kind of moving towards the end here, but there's interesting stuff coming up here. We're going to get to Jesus in these different Quran translations. Okay, I'm going to pull up a couple of bullet points and just take a drink from my coffee here. 1 second. Okay, so first we're going to speak about Quran 2191. You have the Arabic there. وَالَّتِي أَحْسَنَتْ فَرْجَهَا فَنَفَخْنَا فِيهَا مِنْ رُوحِنَا وَجَعَلْنَاهَا وَإِبْنَهَا آيَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. Okay, so Muhammad Asad translates this, and remember her who guarded her chastity, whereupon we breathed into her of our spirit and caused her together with her son to become a symbol of our grace unto all people. Okay, so pretty straightforward translation. It's pretty clear, and Muslim tradition generally agrees that this is a reference to Mary. Mary is the one who guarded her chastity. This is actually an anatomical term here, but rendered here as chastity. Mary is the one who guarded chastity, and then God breathed into her, or maybe not, we'll see in a second, of his spirit in order that she would conceive Jesus. So that's why there's a reference here, her together with her son, in other words, Mary and Jesus, became a symbol, is a reference for ayah. Usually people say sign, but symbol to all people, okay? There is a variant of this, Quran 66:12, where instead of fiha, it's fihi. It refers back to the farj. So if you're interested, look at Quran 66:12. Okay, Hilali Khan, however, sort of varies from Muhammad Asad's standard translation by, as I mentioned, incorporating the hadith. Okay, so even though the Arabic clearly says nafakhna, that is, God says, we, remember God often uses we in the Quran, we breathed into her. So Hilali Khan renders this, we breathe into and then add something that is not in the Arabic at all, the sleeves of her shirt or garment, and then add something else, or that's kind of in there, but takes it in a totally new direction, which is through our Ruh, Jibril, Gabriel. Okay, so just to explain what they're doing here is they want to avoid the impression, even though it's interesting because Halali Khan are actually the Salafis and Muhammad Asad is actually the rationalist. Anyway, I mean, so you'd think a Salafi would be okay with anthropomorphisms, but they want to avoid the impression that God physically, with his mouth, for example, breathed into Mary. And so they have this tradition, which comes in the hadith, that it wasn't God at all. Even if the Quran says nafakhna, it was actually Gabriel who did the breathing. And he didn't breathe right into Mary, but he breathed into an opening or into the sleeves of her shirt. Okay? And so you can kind of make this work maybe with the Arabic, because it kind of depends how you read min ruhina. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that the role of Ruh is to be the agent of Mary's conception of Jesus. So like it is through the spirit that is God's spirit. I mean, it actually says Ruhina, that Mary conceives, but they're saying, no. Ruh is a reference to the angel Gabriel. So it's not a spirit at all. It's just kind of a nickname for the angel. And min ruhina, nafakhna min ruhina. I mean, somehow they see God saying that, like, through the agency of the angel Gabriel, we breathed into her. Okay, so a lot of work is done there. I mean, you can find different traditions, akhbar or ahadith, which speak of that. Okay, and basically, Sahih International follows this, but without adding the bit of the sleeves of the garment. I mean, just circling back, Muhammad Asad, he does have a rationalist take on this. So his rationalist does come through, but it comes through in a note. And this is another topic. So this is not the sleeves and the garment and all that. He writes, this allegorical expression used here with reference to Mary's conception of Jesus has been widely and erroneously interpreted as relating specifically to Jesus's birth. That is, many people think only Jesus conceived through God's Spirit. As a matter of fact, the Quran uses the same expression in 3 other places with reference to the creation of man in general. I mean, there is actually a connection to the way the Quran speaks of the conception of Adam, which takes place through God breathing. So there's that. Okay, I'm going to move on to Quran 3:45. In a way, we're kind of going backwards because, the verse from Quran 21 referred to the conception of Jesus, whereas Quran 3:45 refers to the annunciation to Mary about the conception of Jesus. Okay, so here we have the Arabic. إذ قالت الملائكة يا مريم إن الله يبشرك بكلمة منه اسمها المسيح عيسى بن مريم وجيه في الدنيا وفي الآخرة ومن المقربين. Okay, so Muhammad Asad, again, his translation, except for one thing, is pretty straightforward. The angel said, O Mary, behold, God sends thee the glad tidings. Now, usually most translations render of a word from him, but he renders through a word from him. And we'll see why in a moment. Of a son who shall become known as the Christ Jesus, shall become known. Okay. It's kind of off of the Arabic a bit, of great honor in this world and in life to come, and shall be of those who are drawn near to God. Okay. Hilary Khan, basically the same. Although we're beginning to understand what's going on here with these translations, which are seeking to separate or distinguish the Quranic take on Jesus from the Gospel's take on Jesus, right? Because here in Hilal Khan, they do say of a word, but then parenthetically they add, the word was, like literally the Arabic word was kun, in English be, and he was. Okay, and then the rest is kind of straightforward. As Sahih International is basically the standard translation. So they don't follow through a word or add this bit about be or kun. They simply say God gives you good tidings of a word from him. They don't capitalize word, so that's interesting. Here they actually do capitalize a word. It's kind of weird because they don't want to see the word as Jesus, but whatever. Okay, so basically what's going on is Muhammad Asad and Hilali Khan are avoiding the possibility that the Quran is using this theologically rich and heavily Christian vibe term, kelima, to refer to Jesus. Remember that John's Gospel begins with, in the beginning, he's sort of riffing on Genesis 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the verses that follow make it clear that the Word is Jesus. And so, this is the Greek. There is logos, which has all sorts of importance philosophically, but also in Second Temple Judaism. So they want to avoid this, that the Quran is using this Christian term, calling Jesus the Word, even though it does appear in Quran chapter 4, verse 171 as well. But anyway, they want to say, no, the word is kun, or be, because in Quran 3:47, it says when God decides on an issue, qada amran, he simply says kun. Okay, so there's that. Now, Muhammad Asad has another note, again on a different issue, so not about the word business. He's attentive, presumably because his knowledge of Judaism, to the Quran naming Jesus Messiah. Most commentators, they just breeze right past this. But those who know the Bible know that, and Judaism, live Judaism, Christianity, know that Messiah is super important. The whole division between Judaism and Christianity, there's more than this, but the heart of the matter is Jesus a Messiah or not? Are we waiting for another to come who will be the Messiah? Okay, so Muhammad Asad knows this. In the Quran, Messiah appears to be just like a title or a nickname or something, but he's gosh, he just knows Messiah is a really theologically rich term, so he wants to explain it in a way that is consistent with his Islamic beliefs. Maybe you've already read this. He knows that Messiah basically in Hebrew means anointing. It means kind of rubbing, usually in Arabic, but in Hebrew it means anointing. And he says, well, basically it's because from his foster father's side, that of Joseph, he descends from the royal house of David, and basically Messiah is associated with king. And so Jesus, because he's a descendant of King David through his foster father, Joseph, then he is referred to as Messiah. It's not very convincing. Why wasn't every single descendant of David then called the Messiah? This is not what's going on, at least in the Gospels. Just read the Gospels. This is not what's going on with the name Messiah. This is not how Jews understand Messiah, so it's kind of a big stretch. Anyway, he just wants to, in the end, he just explains why he uses Christ, just to say Hebrew, Mashiach, becomes Christos in Greek, which is where English gets the word Christ, and so he says it's fine to use Christ. Okay, enough of that. On to Quran 5, Al-Ma'idah 111 and 112. This is the bit that leads up to the famous scene of the Ma'idah, or the table from heaven. So you have the Arabic there. The rendering of Muhammad Asad actually is unusual, particularly in the way he uses this term, white-garbed ones. We'll get back to a second. As more standard translation is Sahih International. Remember when I inspired to the disciples, I just want to point out here, it's interesting, the Quran uses the word al-haytu, which is from wahi. So wahi is being given to the disciples, hawariyun, and it's not like vague wahi, it's a direct speech, like actual words are being given to the disciples. God says to the disciples, Aminu bi wa bi rasuli. Right? Those are the Arabic words that God speaks to the disciples through wahi. So that's pretty interesting. They said, we have believed, so bear witness that we indeed are Muslims, or maybe Muhammad Asad is better, surrendered ourselves. I mean, the Arabic is Muslimun, but is there such a thing as Muslim with a capital M before Muhammad? To be Muslim, you usually have to believe in Muhammad. So maybe it just means, the Arabic word means surrendered ourselves. Yeah, so, and it goes on in the introduction to the table or Ma'idah. I could speak a lot about that. I'm not going to. I just want to note a couple of things about Muhammad Asad's translation that are really interesting. First of all, the Arabic word for disciples is hawariyun. I mean, here it's hawariyin because it is in the genitive. So, Hilal Khan, they just keep the Arabic there. But Muhammad Asad translates white garbed ones. And the reason for this is because the Arabic root ha wa ara has to do with white. This is actually what's connected or what is in the term used for the so-called maidens or virgins of paradise in the Qur'an, who are referred to as hur'in. So that's that root, because the understanding is that they have white eye, or like a lot of white in their eyes. So he says white garbed ones. He actually goes on to say, and maybe this should be expanded upon in a video about Muhammad Asad, but he goes on to say that, well, they're the white garbed ones because they used to wear white. Many Muslim traditions, they say this. They're just trying to figure out why the Quran uses hawariyun. By the way, the Quran uses hawariyun because in Ethiopic, this is the word for the disciples of Jesus. It has nothing to do with white in Ethiopic. It literally means those who walk, but it's used in the Ethiopic Bible for the disciples of Jesus, probably because they walk alongside Jesus. But Muslim commentators are like, why is the Quran calling this the white ones? And mostly it's white garbed ones. But Muhammad Asad goes a step further, and he says, probably the disciples of Jesus were members of this group known as the Essenes from Qumran. And the Essenes, where Qumran is, by the Dead Sea Scrolls, maybe not, lots of, scholarly debates around this, but the Essenes were concerned with purity and they wore white garments. Okay, so here is a long note. I don't know if I should speak about this. It's pretty interesting. It just shows the rationalism of Muhammad Asad. Many 20th century Muslims sort of embrace this kind of rationalism, which want to sort of emphasize the ongoing nature of God's relationship with humanity generally, as opposed to see passages in the Quran speaking of kind of one-off supernatural events. So, what he says, what they're asking for, the Hawariyun or the apostles of Jesus, when they query Jesus as to whether his Lord can send down a table, they're not asking actually for a table from heaven. Remember, I said that Muhammad Asad doesn't like these supernatural events. They're not really asking for a table from heaven. It's more like the Lord's Prayer or the Our Father prayer, give us this day our daily bread. They're asking just for regular sort of sustenance. So they mean, but he does note that there may be something that contradicts his first idea, because they do speak of reassuring our hearts. And so he kind of, hedges his bets there. Okay, but he does say when God finally says, I'm going to send it down to you, the Quran has God not, simply say unezzilu in sort of an indicative verb. God instead says inni munezziluha, so using the active participle, which, he says, this grammatical form means continual sort of provision of sustenance. So this is very 20th century rationalism there from Muhammad Asad. Okay, last one, I think. I was already forgetting what I put in the PowerPoint, but I think this is the last one, which is Quran 61:14, which gets us to this very interesting question of whether there is a kind of militancy around the figure of Jesus in the Quran. So Quran 61:14, There's an early reference in the same surah to Jesus, but here in verse 14, let's do Sahih International here. O you who have believed, this is a reference probably to God addressing Muhammad's community, be supporters of Allah. So kunu ansar Allah. As when Jesus, and then God appeals to Jesus, as when Jesus, the son of Mary, said to the disciples, Min ansari ilallah, who are my supporters for Allah. The disciples said, again, the word is hawariyun, so we see, where is it? Yeah, white garbed ones coming up with Muhammad Asad. Disciples said, we are supporters of Allah, and a faction of the children of Israel believed, and a faction, Ta'ifa, disbelieved. So we supported those who believed against their enemy, and they became dominant, or really, they prevailed. Yeah, Zahirin, they were victorious. What were they victorious in? It's pretty hard to understand this verse, but it seems to be an allusion to some sort of militant struggle of the followers of Jesus against other members who denied the prophet, who were disbelievers. And then God takes the side of the believers, those who accept the prophet, and they defeat their enemies. And the context seems to be, by tradition, this is a Medinan surah, seems to be Muhammad's community. And God is saying to the believers, rally around Muhammad in militancy against the unbelievers, and I will support you, just as what happened with Jesus and his supporters when I supported them, and they vanquished or prevailed against their enemies. Okay? This militancy is sort of picked up on by Hilali Khan when they sort of paraphrase or gloss the Hawariyun as saying, we will strive in his cause, which is, not code language, but, the language used by the Qur'an for a sort of declaration of courage and faithfulness in battle. Okay, so I just thought I would go ahead and, Muhammad Asad is so interesting because he has these long notes. He's just saying, what does it mean that the Quran has followers affirm that they believe in Jesus? And basically, he wants to say here that the followers are not believing in Jesus in the way that Christians believe in Jesus, but rather are believing in Jesus the way that certain figures like Arius in early Christian tradition accepted Jesus not as the Son of God, which he actually did. This isn't a great sort of scholarship here on early development of Christianity. Arius actually accepted Jesus, Son of God, but denied that he was consubstantial with the Father. But he wants to find some, clue or hint in early Christianity that something like Islamic belief about Jesus was found there. Okay, I won't go on further about that. Again, I hope to do a video on Muhammad Asad. Okay, so final bit here, just, emphasize some things. I want to make a comment about Mark Dury's book because he seems to come to this conclusion about the Quran's theology. By this conclusion, I mean what I'm about to say. Dury emphasizes the distinct theological world of the Quran. There's a bunch that I disagree with in Dury's book. I think basically he misses the development of Christianity and Judaism in late antiquity and the way the Quran engages with that, or the way the Quran depends on its audience's biblical knowledge. But I think it's right that the Quran marches to the beat of its own theological drum. And this is really visible or evident with the question of Jesus. For example, the Quran calls Jesus a Messiah, but Jesus doesn't have anything messianic in the Quran. Some of these translators, they're so concerned to make the Jesus of the Quran different from the Jesus of the Gospels that, in my humble opinion, they go a little too far. The Quran says nothing about breathing into the sleeves of Mary's garment, let alone Gabriel breathing into the sleeves. Bashara bi is pretty common for giving the good news of. It's just standard normal Arabic, but Muhammad Asad kind of changes that into through a word from him. So Jesus is not the word, but it's through a word. The word is kun. But I mean, overall, all three translations do the right thing by avoiding a Christianizing reading of Jesus in the Quran. The Quran is not a Christian document. If anything, it's polemical against Christian doctrine. And so the Quran effectively creates a new Jesus who even predicts Muhammad, Quran 7:157 and Quran 61:6, and probably has Jesus go to war with his Ansar or Hawariyun. Also, Quran 9:111 sort of mysteriously says those who die in war or kill in war will have a reward. So that, Quran 9:111, that's in the Quran, that verse then says that is found in the gospel, in the Injil. It's not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, because the Quran's concern is not sort of replicate what's in the Gospels, but to create a new Jesus. Why does the Quran create a new Jesus? Well, for the same reason that it departs from the Bible with other prophets, like Noah, for example, who in Genesis 6-8 does not speak before the flood, but in the Quran becomes someone who anticipates Muhammad's preaching to his people. So too, Jesus of the Quran, that is Isa, becomes a figure who's meant to sort of anticipate Muhammad. So he's reshaped for the sake of the Quran's own prophet. Okay, thank you so much for listening in and being with me this whole time. I'd be really grateful if you're still listening, if you could spread the news about exploring the Quran and the Bible, and of course, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe.